Do not scroll any further. What you are about to hear will make you shudder and forget forever about the glitter of red carpets. We are used to seeing them as gods, bathing in champagne and diamonds, but behind the facade of the greatest film studios lurked a ruthless meat grinder that spat yesterday's idols onto the pavement like useless trash. You will learn about 10 legends whose faces were known in every household on the planet, yet who ended their days in cardboard boxes, free shelters, and filthy ditches. The final story, about a sex symbol found dead in a stinking basement, will absolutely blow your mind. Watch until the end to see the true, snarling face of Hollywood. And before we begin with the first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show. Veronica Lake, a woman who in the 1940s was not merely an actress, she was a religion. Her peekaboo hairstyle, a golden wave of hair cascading over her right eye, became a national treasure of the United States. Millions of women around the world cut their hair and burned it with curling irons just to resemble her for a single moment. The U.S. government even asked her to change her look during the war because female workers at defense plants were injuring themselves by copying her hairstyle, their curls getting caught in machinery. She sat at the very top of Hollywood's food chain, earning so much money she could have paved a road of gold from Los Angeles to New York. But the way her life ended is one of the dirtiest and most terrifying secrets of the Dream Factory. The truth is, Hollywood is not a city, it is a meat grinder, and Veronica Lake was caught in its gears at the very moment she stood at her peak. Paramount producers adored her face but despised what lay beneath it. Colleagues on set called her a snake and a psychopath. The famous Frederick March refused to work with her, declaring that life was too short for Veronica Lake. As long as she brought in millions, everything was forgiven, the drinking, the tantrums, the ruined shooting days. But in Hollywood, there is one sin that is never forgiven, the loss of box office appeal. The moment the fashion for fatal blondes began to fade, the studio discarded her like a used napkin. Her contract was not renewed, the phones fell silent, and that is where the real nightmare begins. Veronica, accustomed to limousines and lavish estates, discovered that her accounts were empty. Where had the millions gone? Gigolo husbands, disastrous investments, and endless bills from psychiatric clinics devoured everything. Yesterday's goddess found herself in an unthinkable position. She could no longer pay her rent. By the early 1960s, Veronica Lake had effectively become a ghost. She fled Hollywood, hiding from shame under assumed names. The great star lived in cheap, weaking motels where wallpaper peeled from the walls and the screams of dock workers echoed through the corridors at night. She drank a lot, cheaply and alone, trying to drown the memories of a time when her name once burned in neon on Times Square. The shocking climax came in 1962. A gossip columnist wandered into a rundown cocktail bar in Brooklyn, a place frequented by society's rejects and petty thieves. Behind the counter, he saw a woman whose face seemed vaguely familiar. Gray, unkempt hair, a bloated face ravaged by alcohol, rough hands beneath a cheap apron. It was Veronica Lake. The screen goddess was working as a waitress. She carried beer and wiped filthy tables for spare change. When she was recognized, a scandal erupted. Newspapers ran headlines screaming, "Star in the slums." Veronica tried to preserve her dignity, saying, "I just want to be among people," but everyone understood the truth. She simply could not afford a piece of bread. She had no home, no family who wanted to know her, nothing at all, except old photographs stuffed into a torn suitcase. The Hollywood system destroyed her not only financially, but physically. Years of alcoholism and life in unheated holes took their toll. In 1973, she was admitted to a state hospital in Vermont.
She had no money for a private room and lay in a ward for the poor under the name Connie Egan. Doctors diagnosed hepatitis and acute kidney failure. On July 7, 1973, Veronica Lake died at the age of 50. But even death brought her no peace. The story of her ashes is Hollywood's final spit in the face of her former queen. There was no money for a proper funeral, her body was cremated, and the ashes, well, were never claimed. For years, the urn containing the remains of the greatest actress of the 1940s gathered dust on a shelf in a funeral home. None of her former husbands came for it, not her children, not a single studio that had earned millions from her name. Only many years later did a group of enthusiasts buy her remains to scatter them over the ocean. Veronica Lake was the first to prove that in Hollywood you are either on the throne or in the gutter. There is no middle ground. She traveled the road from golden curls to a filthy waitress's apron and ended her days a homeless drifter in her own country. This woman once commanded the minds of millions, yet could not hold on to a roof over her head. And this is only the beginning of our list.
Bela Lugosi. What you are about to learn will shatter the romantic image of the great artist. Bela Lugosi made the most terrible mistake an actor can make in Hollywood. He became a prisoner of a single role. He fused so completely with Dracula that studios stopped seeing a man behind the cape. When the fashion for classic monsters faded, Lugosi discovered that he was not merely unwanted, he had become a joke. Yesterday's aristocrat, the owner of a lavish estate filled with antiques and rare wines, suddenly found himself in a world where his talent was worth less than nothing. Yet Lugosi's true tragedy was not the lack of roles, but his devastating addiction. Years of relentless work and chronic back pain led him to morphine and methadone. It was a pit with no way out. All the millions he had earned on the blood and screams of audiences flowed straight into the pockets of dealers of death. Bela Lugosi, the grand aristocrat of the screen, dissolved into a trembling shadow of himself. His mansion was seized for debts, his wives left one after another, unable to watch the idol of millions turn into a helpless, broken creature. By the 1950s, Lugosi's story had reached its lowest point. The great Count Dracula was forced to move from one furnished room to another, sinking ever deeper into the slums of Los Angeles. These were places where hallways reeked of cheap food and bleach, where drunken fights echoed through paper-thin walls at night. He had no place of his own. He was, in essence, homeless, a famous name with nowhere to sleep. To scrape together money for the next dose and another night in a shabby boarding house, Lugosi accepted any work offered him. It was then that Ed Wood found him, the man history would later label the worst director of all time. Wood used Lugosi as bait, casting him in his absurd, penny-pinching films like Plan 9 from Outer Space. Bela worked for crumbs, sometimes merely for food or the promise of medicine. Audiences who saw him in these films could hardly believe their eyes. On screen was an emaciated, gravely ill old man with a deadened gaze. He no longer inspired fear, only pity. Colleagues recalled that Lugosi could sit for hours in the dressing room, staring into nothingness, fully aware that his life had turned into a cruel joke. In 1955, Lugosi took a step unheard of at the time. He voluntarily admitted himself to a state clinic for the poor to treat his addiction. He had no money for private doctors. He lay in a shared ward among vagrants and criminals, while newspapers eagerly feasted on the downfall of the Count. When he was released, he owned nothing but his faithful Dracula cape, the one he had never pawned. In 1956, Bela Lugosi died of a heart attack in his tiny rented apartment, furnished only with a bed and an old trunk.
He left behind no savings, not even enough for a modest burial. The funeral was paid for by Frank Sinatra, who had secretly helped the actor in his final months, along with Ed Wood. Lugosi was buried in his famous black cape, the one he had never pawned. The man who taught the world to fear the dark ended his life in the complete darkness of poverty and solitude. He was a homeless king, his crown made of cardboard, his castle built from the filthy walls of cheap flophouses. Hollywood drained him to the last drop and tossed the empty shell onto the trash heap of history. And if you think this is the lowest a legend can fall, prepare yourself.
Louise Brooks. What you are about to hear is the story of how one of the brightest stars of silent cinema turned into an invisible woman, wandering for years through filthy corners of the city, unable to afford even an extra piece of bread. Louise Brooks committed what Hollywood considers a mortal sin. She refused to obey. When the studio demanded that she return to dub her film after the arrival of sound cinema, she simply said no and left for Europe. She believed her talent and fame were a shield. She did not understand that the studios were a punitive machine. Her name was placed on a blacklist, and when she returned, Hollywood greeted her with icy silence. Brooks's fall was not merely swift, it was devastating. Yesterday's multi-millionaire who spent thousands of dollars on parties and couture suddenly discovered that no one would cast her anymore, not even in supporting roles, not even as an extra. Her name was erased from the industry's memory. Within a few years, her savings melted away like first snow. Drinking companions from high society vanished the moment Louise ran out of money for alcohol. By the 1940s, the situation became critical. The former screen goddess, whose portraits once hung in every movie theater, found herself on the brink of real homelessness. She was forced into an act of humiliation that burned inside her for the rest of her life. She took a job as an ordinary sales clerk at Saks Fifth Avenue in New York. Imagine it. People who had once paid to see her on screen now walked past her, snapped at her for slow gift wrapping, or demanded exact change, never recognizing the pale, exhausted woman behind the counter as the great Louise Brooks. She worked for pennies, barely enough to pay for a tiny, foul-smelling room in a cheap boarding house. But fate was not finished with her. Louise was fired from the department store as well. Left without work and without connections, she effectively became an urban ghost. There were periods when she had no permanent address at all. She lived in unheated shacks where mold crept across the walls, and the only source of warmth was a gas burner, if she had the money to pay for it. For months, her diet consisted of plain beans and cheap tea. She was too proud to ask for help, preferring to starve slowly in obscurity rather than admit defeat to the system. Her life became an endless drift through furnished rooms that stank of old clothes and despair. The great style icon turned into a lonely, embittered woman who feared going outside, terrified of colliding with her past. At one point, she even considered joining those who sold their bodies near dockside bars simply to avoid dying of hunger. She was saved only by a miracle. In the 1950s, film historians rediscovered her work, finding her in one of these slums, forgotten, sick, and nearly feral. Louise Brooks died in 1985. Although she gained some recognition late in life as a writer, most of her years were spent fighting to survive. She proved that Hollywood can lift you to Olympus and then hurl you into the deepest, darkest ditch the moment you dare to defy its rules. She was a homeless legend who once ruled the hearts of millions, yet did not even have a pillow of her own on which to rest her head during the hardest years of her life.
Bobby Driscoll. Brace yourself, because this story is the dirtiest stain on Mickey Mouse's pristine white glove. We like to believe Walt Disney was a kind-hearted storyteller, but to Bobby Driscoll, he became an executioner. Bobby was not just a child actor. He was the first person in history to sign an exclusive contract with Disney. He was the Golden Boy, a living embodiment of the post-war American dream. The whole world knew him as Peter Pan, the boy who could fly and promised never to grow up. But Hollywood is a place where time follows the laws of a nightmare. The moment Bobby turned 16, his fairy dust turned into poison. The tragedy began with the betrayal of biology itself. In 1953, Bobby entered puberty. His voice started to crack. Acne appeared on his face. To Disney's corporate machine, he instantly transformed from a priceless asset into defective merchandise. The execution was swift and merciless. When Bobby arrived at the studio as usual, a security guard at the gate simply blocked his way. He was not even allowed to retrieve his personal belongings from his dressing room. The contract was terminated overnight. Walt Disney, who had hugged the boy on camera like a loving father, did not come out to say goodbye. Bobby was tossed beyond the gates like a broken toy that could no longer be sold. The fall was catastrophic. Imagine a child who had lived under spotlights and applause since the age of 6 suddenly dropped into an ordinary high school where classmates tormented him with particular cruelty. "Look, it's the former star. Where are your wings now, flyer?" Bobby had no idea how to live in the real world. To numb the pain of the greatest betrayal of his life, he turned to drugs. By 17, Peter Pan was deeply addicted to heroin. By the early 1960s, nothing remained of his former glory. Bobby Driscoll became a regular in jails and rehabilitation centers. All his childhood earnings, hundreds of thousands of dollars, had vanished. Some went to taxes, some were squandered by his parents, the rest flowed straight into his veins. He became a wandering ghost, drifting from one filthy den to another. Yesterday's idol of millions now slept on stained mattresses in abandoned New York buildings, sharing scraps of food with rats. His face, once the standard of childlike beauty, hardened into an emaciated death mask, scarred and ulcered from needles. The final act came in March 1968, and it reads like a frame from the bleakest thriller. 2 teenagers playing in an abandoned apartment building in Lower Manhattan stumbled upon a body. A man lay on the floor among broken bricks, empty bottles, and used syringes. There was not a single cent or document in the pockets of his rags. The body was so wasted and unrecognizable that police recorded the death of an unknown vagrant, approximately 40 years old, though Bobby was only 31. Since no one came to claim the body, corpse number 42 was sent to Hart Island, the infamous cemetery for the poor, the homeless, and the unidentified. There, in a mass grave, in a cheap pine coffin marked only by a number, was the man who once made the entire world believe in miracles. Only a year and a half later, when his mother began searching through the police, fingerprints revealed the shocking truth. The world learned that Disney's Golden Boy had long been rotting in the ground among criminals and drifters. Hollywood didn't merely forget Bobby Driscoll, it erased him. The studio that earned millions from his face did not even offer condolences. His story is a permanent reminder that in the dream factory, you matter as long as your face fits the dimensions of a poster. The moment you grow up or break down, you are spat into the gutter, without anyone bothering to remember your name.
Frances Farmer. In the 1930s, Frances Farmer was a rising star at Paramount. She was immensely talented, but she despised Hollywood with every fiber of her being. She refused to attend fake parties, refused to stage romances for publicity, and openly declared her left-wing political views. To the studio bosses, she was a problem asset. And when Frances began showing signs of depression and slipped into alcoholism, the system did not try to heal her, it decided to isolate her. In 1943, real hell began. After a series of minor run-ins with the law, Frances was declared mentally unstable. But the most terrifying betrayal came from her own mother. Living off stipends arranged by studio lawyers, she signed the papers granting guardianship and authorizing forced commitment. Frances Farmer, yesterday's screen icon, was shackled and sent to the Steilacoom State Hospital. It was a place contemporaries called a rat hole. What Frances endured within those walls would shame any horror filmmaker. She was housed in overcrowded wards with the most severely ill patients, where urine and feces pooled on the floors. She was subjected to electroshock therapy without anesthesia, held in ice baths for hours. But the most vile abuse happened at night. Orderlies organized so-called tours for soldiers from a nearby military base. For a few dollars, they allowed the men to rape the great actress. Frances Farmer was turned into a free prostitute for sadists, hidden behind a diagnosis of schizophrenia. In 1945, according to reports confirmed by many biographers, she underwent a transorbital lobotomy, a procedure in which an instrument was driven through the eye socket, breaking the skull and destroying parts of the brain responsible for will and emotion. Hollywood needed a compliant Frances, and if she could not be a compliant star, she had to become a silent vegetable. When Frances was finally released in 1950, nothing remained of the brilliant woman she had once been. She had no home, no money, no family. Her mother had effectively sold her life for studio checks. The once great actress, whose portraits had adorned magazine covers, settled in a grim neighborhood, in a tiny room whose walls seemed soaked with despair. To avoid starving to death, she took a job in a hotel laundry. Picture it. Hotel guests, perhaps reminiscing about old films over drinks in the bar, handed their filthy sheets and underwear to a woman with empty eyes and an invisible wound in her soul, never suspecting that this was Frances Farmer. She lived in absolute poverty, among people at the very bottom of society. She was homeless inside her own body, a body that no longer belonged to her. Frances Farmer died in 1970 from esophageal cancer at the age of 56. She died alone and forgotten. Her story is a grim reminder that Hollywood does not merely take your youth. It can reach into your skull and cut your personality out of you if you refuse to play by its rules. She was a queen forced to scrub other people's dirt, while her own life drained into the gutter.
Hattie McDaniel. In 1940, at the Academy Awards ceremony, Hattie McDaniel did the impossible. She became the first African American to receive Hollywood's highest honor. But do you know what it really looked like? She was allowed into the Ambassador Hotel where the ceremony took place only by special permission. She did not sit at the same table as her co-stars Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh. The evening's triumvirator was placed at a tiny table against the wall, at the far end of the ballroom, near the kitchen. Hollywood handed her a statuette, but refused to grant her the right to be treated as a human being. The real nightmare began once the camera flashes faded. Despite her historic victory, Hattie was offered nothing but servant roles. "I'd rather play a maid for $700 than be a maid for $7, she joked bitterly. But the studios paid her pennies compared to white actors. While her colleagues bought ranches and yachts, Hattie barely scraped by, struggling to maintain the image of a star, an image that demanded enormous spending on clothes and social appearances just to remain visible in the industry. In the early 1950s, fate struck her with crushing force. Hattie was diagnosed with breast cancer. At the same moment, the Internal Revenue Service presented her with an $11,000 tax bill, an unbearable sum for an actress whose career was rapidly collapsing. The system began to tear her apart. While she lay in a hospital bed, fighting metastases, tax agents cataloged her belongings. Her furniture, her jewelry, her personal possessions, everything was auctioned off for a fraction of its value.
Hattie McDaniel was dying in poverty, effectively on the edge of homelessness as her home was under seizure. But the most tragic fate befell that very Oscar. According to one account, the statuette was transferred to Howard University and later vanished without a trace. According to another, Hattie was forced to pawn it to pay at least part of her medical bills. The symbol of her greatest triumph was reduced to a piece of metal exchanged for cash to buy painkillers. On October 26, 1952, Hattie died at the age of 57 in a hospital at the California Motion Picture Country Home. But Hollywood chose to humiliate her even in death. In her will, Hattie expressed a final wish. "I want to be buried at Hollywood Cemetery beside my colleagues." The cemetery's owner, Jules Roth, issued a categorical refusal. The reason was simple and brutal: racial segregation. The cemetery was whites only. Even an Oscar in her hands did not grant a black woman the right to rest in the same ground as those she had worked beside. She was buried in a less prestigious cemetery in a poorer district, and her estate was so insignificant that her heirs received nothing but debt. Hattie McDaniel was a queen without a kingdom, an idol adored by millions who ended her journey alone, penniless, and denied the dignity of a proper resting place. She was homeless in the very industry she helped make great.
John Gilbert. In the mid-1920s, he was not just an actor. He was the very standard of masculinity. They called him the Great Lover, and it was no exaggeration. When he appeared on screen opposite Greta Garbo, the sparks between them were so real that audiences could barely breathe. Gilbert lived large, as befits an emperor of the screen. His weekly paycheck reached an unimaginable $10,000 at a time when an ordinary family could live an entire year on that sum. His mansion, Enchanted Hill, was a monument to excess, complete with private stables, tennis courts, and basements stocked with the finest bootleg liquor of the Prohibition era. But in 1929, Hollywood was struck by sound, and for John Gilbert, it was the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut. What happened next is considered by many historians the most expensive character assassination in film history. John Gilbert had an enemy, the all-powerful head of MGM, Louis B. Mayer. Their hatred for each other ran so deep that at one point during the wedding of Grace Kelly and King Vidor, they came to blows in a restroom. Mayer reportedly shouted, "I'll destroy you, even if it costs me $1 million," and he meant it. When it came time to record sound for Gilbert's first talkie, His Glorious Night, the sound engineers, acting on Mayer's orders, deliberately altered the audio frequencies. When audiences heard their idol's voice at the premiere, the theater erupted, but it was not applause, it was uncontrollable laughter. Gilbert's voice sounded unnaturally high, almost ridiculous. The image of the fierce, passionate macho disintegrated within the first 5 minutes of screen time. The next morning, newspapers ran mocking headlines. Gilbert, a man of fragile nerves and towering ego, was crushed. But Mayer was not finished. He refused to release the actor from his contract, forcing him into cheap, humiliating films with absurd dialogue, determined to turn the great lover into a public joke once and for all. The fall into financial ruin was as swift as the collapse of his career. Gilbert knew no other way to live. He continued to maintain a large household staff and throw lavish parties, trying to prove to the world and to himself that he was still on top. But bank notices arrived more often than film offers. Enchanted Hill became a debt trap. Taxes, mortgages, and the upkeep of his car collection devoured his millions in just a few years. Yesterday's god of Hollywood suddenly found himself unable to pay the electric bill in his own palace. By the early 1930s, Gilbert had effectively become a pariah. He was evicted from his mansion, his art collection was sold at auction, yesterday's friends stopped returning his calls.
The great John Gilbert was forced to move into a cheap furnished boarding house where his neighbors were failed salesmen and prostitutes. It was a fall from which no one recovers. He locked himself in a cramped room that smelled of dampness and dust and began systematically killing himself with alcohol. Picture the horror. The man who once held Greta Garbo's hand, whose profile had been stamped onto gold coins, now sat alone clutching a bottle of cheap whiskey, listening through thin walls to the coughing of other lost souls. He was homeless in spirit, stripped of his kingdom and his voice. His only lifeline was Greta Garbo's attempt to bring him back to the screen in Queen Christina, but it was too late. Gilbert arrived on set with trembling hands, his heart worn down by alcohol and endless humiliation. On January 9, 1936, the great lover died of a heart attack. He was only 38 years old. He was found in a rented apartment that resembled a kennel more than a star's home. He left behind almost nothing. No property, no savings, only piles of empty bottles and faded posters from the silent era. Hollywood did not merely take his money, it stripped him of the right to be a man in the eyes of the public. John Gilbert became a brutal example of how quickly a golden boy can turn into a drifter when he dares to challenge those who control the microphone.
Mae Murray. In 1920s Hollywood, there was no star brighter, more capricious or wealthier than Mae Murray. She was called the Garbo of Central Park and the girl with the bee-stung lips. She was the absolute monarch of MGM. Her legs, the primary instrument of her success, were insured for an astronomical $3 million, an unheard-of sum at the time. She lived in a world where floors were covered with white polar bear skins and champagne flowed from fountains. Mae Murray believed she was cinema itself, and everyone else, including studio bosses, were merely part of the set. But Hollywood is not a theater. It is a business, and it never forgives those who forget who really signs the checks. The collapse began in 1927, when Mae committed what amounted to professional suicide in a fit of rage. After yet another argument with the great and terrible Louis B. Mayer over a script, she flung her resignation in his face, shouting that she would find herself a better studio. Mayer, with the memory of an elephant and the soul of an executioner, simply smiled and blacklisted her. Overnight, Mae Murray went from the most coveted actress in Hollywood to persona non grata. She soon discovered that no studio in the world would pick up the phone when her agent called. Her financial annihilation was completed by her marriage to Prince David Modigliani. The man was a professional vulture. He convinced Mae that her millions needed to work and began pouring them into absurd investments that failed one after another. While Murray battled studios in court, desperately trying to reclaim her former glory, Modigliani methodically siphoned money from her accounts. When they divorced in 1933, it turned out that nothing remained of her vast fortune but debt and stacks of unpaid bills. Her luxurious Hollywood villa was seized by tax authorities. Her diamond collection was sold off through pawn shops. Her furs were eaten by moths in the basements of court bailiffs. The 1940s marked the most terrifying, wandering phase of her life. The former diva, accustomed to limousines, moved to New York where no one knew her. There, Mae Murray finally lost her grip on reality. She became the city's madwoman, the ghost of Fifth Avenue. New Yorkers watched with unease as a woman roamed the streets in faded, torn satin gowns from 30 years earlier. Her face was coated in a thick, almost theatrical layer of makeup that cracked along the wrinkles like a Pierrot mask. Imagine the nightmare. A woman who once dined with princes now slept on benches in Central Park. She spread old newspapers beneath her, the same papers that had once printed glowing reviews of her triumphs. She had no home, no key to her own door, only a torn reticule where she kept yellowed photographs of her posters. Sometimes, at dusk, she would begin dancing her famous Merry Widow waltz right on the sidewalk, hoping passers-by might recognize the great dancer in the ragged old woman and toss her a coin.
To the New York police, she was simply mad vagrant number 5, someone to be periodically chased off with batons so she would not frighten tourists. In 1964 came a finale worthy of pure tragedy. Mae Murray was found unconscious on a street in St. Louis. She was barefoot. The legs once insured for millions were covered in sores and grime. She had been trying to get from New York to Los Angeles on foot. She did not have a single cent for a bus ticket, yet in her clouded mind she was still traveling to the Oscars. She was taken to a state hospital for the indigent under a false name because she could no longer remember who she was. Mae Murray died in 1965 in a retirement home for actors, paid for by other stars out of pity. She died in complete poverty, leaving behind nothing but a pair of worn-out shoes and a legend about how dangerous it is to believe in your own greatness in a city that trades in illusions. She was a homeless icon who once owned the world, yet could not afford even the right to a dignified old age. Hollywood burned her beauty as fuel, and when the fire went out, it simply shoveled up the ashes and threw them onto the pavement.
Barbara Marr. In the 1920s, Barbara Marr was a woman whose name made men tremble and women burn with envy. She was called the girl who was too beautiful. She was the embodiment of the jazz age itself, dangerous, seductive, and astonishingly talented. Barbara did not simply act in films, she lived at 200 miles an hour. She was married 5 times, wrote brilliant screenplays, and was the main cash cow of Metro-Goldwyn. But Hollywood is a ravenous beast. It devoured her youth, her health, and her life. And when she began to die, it tossed her aside like expired merchandise, leaving her to rot in a stinking basement among rats. The truth is that Barbara was a slave to the system in the most literal sense. Studio bosses knew her beauty generated millions, and they exploited her around the clock. To keep her functioning on shooting schedules that stretched to 20 hours a day, she was forcibly hooked on cocaine. Back then, they called it pep vitamins. She was fed drugs so she could dance on camera and tranquilizers so she could sleep for at least 2 hours. But the worst horror began when the studio ordered her to lose weight. What Barbara did to her body defies even nightmares. To maintain the sickly thinness that was fashionable at the time, she went on what was known as the death diet. Barbara willingly swallowed capsules containing tapeworm larvae. Think about it. Inside the body of the most beautiful woman in the world lived a massive parasite, eating her alive so she would not gain a single ounce. She literally fed herself to a worm so the producers would be satisfied with her waistline on screen. By 1925, her body was in ruins. Her immune system, destroyed by cocaine, alcohol, and parasites, finally collapsed. Barbara developed tuberculosis and nephritis. She coughed up blood right on set, and directors shouted, "Keep the coughing, it adds drama." But when she finally became too weak to show up for work, Hollywood's love evaporated instantly. The studio terminated her contract, declaring that sick actresses were unprofitable. Every dollar she had earned vanished into endless parties, the debts of gigolo husbands, and desperate attempts to stay alive. Her financial collapse was as fast as her rise. Creditors stormed her mansion while she was still alive. They seized her furniture, took her jewelry, even confiscated personal letters as she lay delirious with fever. In the end, Barbara Marr, the woman whose profile had been stamped on commemorative medals, became a dying homeless woman. She had nowhere to go. The final refuge of the most beautiful girl in the world was a semi-basement room in a cheap house belonging to acquaintances. Picture the horror. Barbara lay in a damp, dark room where the walls were coated with black mold, and the only view from the windows, set near the floor, was the feet of passers-by. The basement reeked of sewage and decay. She had no money for clean sheets, no money for food, not even money for a glass of clean water.
She died in total isolation, abandoned by all her so-called star friends. The rats scurrying through the corners of that crypt were her only companions in her final days. On January 30th, 1926, her heart stopped. She was only 29 years old. When the attendants carried her body out of the basement, they could not believe that this dried, skeletal figure, weighing barely 84 pounds, was the same dazzling film diva. Hollywood drained everything from her: beauty, talent, money, and flesh itself, leaving tapeworms to finish what remained. Her death was so shameful for the industry that the studios rushed to turn her funeral into a grand spectacle, drowning it in thousands of roses to hide the truth that Barbara died in filth and poverty. But we know the truth. She was a homeless victim of a system that turns people into dust for a few minutes of public pleasure. And this is the end of the fairy tale of the most beautiful girl.
Edith Piaf. Piaf arrived in America like a queen, but Hollywood offered her a pact with the devil. To endure exhausting tours and cope with the pain from countless accidents, she was injected with morphine and fed massive doses of sleeping pills. Money poured in like a river, but it never stayed in her hands. Piaf lived by the rule, "After us, the flood." She supported entire entourages of hangers-on, random lovers, and so-called friends who shamelessly robbed her while she drifted in narcotic haze. By the early 1960s, the golden voice had turned into the rasp of a terminally ill woman. All her American millions evaporated into the pockets of dealers and corrupt managers. Piaf found herself with no property left in the United States, her accounts frozen under the weight of enormous debts. But the most shocking testimonies came from those around her, who spoke of periods of complete disorientation. There were nights when the great Edith Piaf, her mind shattered by another ghost or by withdrawal, would leave her temporary apartment and simply walk off into nowhere. Imagine this horror. A legend of France, a woman applauded by presidents, found asleep in stranger stairwells on filthy staircases in New York and Los Angeles. She sat on the steps, hugging her knees, wearing a cheap coat thrown over a nightgown, unable to understand where she was or even who she was. She had no home of her own in America, only endless hotels that threw her out for unpaid bills and scandals. She was a millionaire vagrant, a woman who owned the souls of millions, yet did not possess the key to her own door. Her American chapter ended in catastrophe. When she returned to France, she was both physically and financially ruined. Her body riddled with needle marks, her liver destroyed by alcohol, her bank account empty. Hollywood drained every song, every emotion, and every dollar from the little sparrow, then left her to die at 47. At the moment of her death, she weighed only 33 kilograms. She owned no property, had no savings, only a legend and debts in the millions that haunted her heirs for years to come. Edith Piaf became the final chord in this list. She proved that even if the whole world belongs to you, Hollywood will find a way to leave you homeless. It is a city that feeds on your light, and when you burn out, it will not even pay for your ticket home.
We have just passed through 10 circles of Hollywood hell. 10 names that should have been carved into golden tablets of history were instead trampled into dirt, poverty, and total oblivion. But the main question that should be burning in your mind right now is this: how could this have happened at all? How could a system that made trillions from these people's images allow them to be found dead in basements, shelters, and city dumps? The answer is frighteningly simple and brutally cynical. Golden Age Hollywood was never a dream factory. It was a human processing plant. Studios owned actors the way plantation owners once owned slaves. Their contracts dictated not only working hours, but who they were allowed to sleep with, whom they should marry, how much they had to weigh, and which drugs they were required to take to stay functional. An actor was not a creator. He or she was a unit, a replaceable part in a massive machine. And when that part wore out, when wrinkles appeared, when a voice cracked, or when pride interfered with obedience, the part was discarded. No severance pay, no medical care, not a shred of mercy. We saw Veronica Lake serving beer in a filthy bar while her films played on television screens. We saw Bobby Driscoll, the boy who could fly, end his flight in a pile of construction debris. We recoiled at the story of Barbara Marr, devoured by tapeworms and cocaine before she even had the chance to grow old. These people were kings and gods only as long as the spotlight burned on them. The moment the switch was flipped off, they were left in total darkness, alone with debts, addictions, and emptiness. This is the true face of the Golden Age. Behind every dazzling frame, behind every diamond smile on the red carpet, lurk the shadows of those who did not survive, did not cope, did not get enough to eat. Hollywood is a graveyard where billboards stand in place of headstones, and the industry still lives by the same laws today. It worships your success, but it is utterly deaf to your pain. Let these stories remind you that glitter is not always gold. Often it is nothing more than light reflected in a puddle at the bottom of a sewer. These 10 legends deserved more than nameless graves and cold stairwells. They gave us magic, and the world repaid them with loneliness and hunger. Now you know the truth, a truth you will never see in studio-approved documentaries, a truth you will never read in glossy memoirs. Write in the comments right now which of these 10 fates made your heart tighten the most. Whose story feels the most unjust to you? Your comment is a tribute to those Hollywood tried to erase from history. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell.